Hello and welcome to New England Authors with Kameel Nasr. It's so good to be with you. New England is just filled with talent, and we're going to explore some of it today. We're going to explore philosophy. We have two wonderful guests with us, Anna Agathangelou and Killian, husband and wife, two academics. And I don't know if you get along well in academia and in marriage, but you've been together since college, right?
Yeah, and that was just a couple of years ago.
Okay. So, Kyle, can I start with you? You've been a therapist, right? And you got interested in interracial couples.
Yeah.
Is that right?
It's true. It's true.
So tell us, how did this come about?
Well, I was in one interracial relationship, but that was almost secondary to my interest. I just noted that there wasn't a lot of literature, articles, research studies, books on that topic, and it seemed like a good thing to explore as a young doctoral student.
Right.
So I kind of look for gaps in literature and want to find out more about things that we don't know that much.
And you did some groundbreaking research. You interviewed couples and so on. Tell us some of your findings.
So I interviewed 20 couples, and one of the things that was sort of interesting and part of the way that I approached the study was I interviewed the partners separately and together.
I see.
I figured if you had them on a love seat, they might be playing the role of agreeing with each other on everything. So I wanted to kind of catch them separately as well. Many of their stories were congruent and did add up, and it was not too surprising. But there were a couple things where sometimes you had a little bit more discussion about incidents of discrimination or prejudice, or a black partner being followed around in a store, or pulled over for driving while black.
Yes.
And that would come up separately, individually, and not so much when they were together. I think maybe sometimes black partners didn't want the white partner to feel uncomfortable or feel like there was something that they needed to speak to or address.
Yes. And Anna, now I found you have very different academic specialties, but I find something that's very tied in with both of you, and I'll want to get your ideas. You've dealt with international relations, and you were a refugee from Cyprus, right?
Exactly.
What impact has this had on your whole life?
Okay, first I want to say, as I was entering the studio, I saw this sign saying "Refugees Welcome."
Refugees welcome.
And I told them that I was a refugee, but I think the people there thought it was kind of funny or a joke, but I am really a refugee.
That's right.
And I was actually displaced in my own country when I was 9.5 years old. So ever since that time, I mean, in a way, it was a kind of a surprise that suddenly, like, there is a war. Tanks are running into the village, airplanes, circling the village, and suddenly everybody says you have to run for your life. So that was my experience with the war, and in the running process, as I was running and my mother was running, my dad was supposed to be like fighting, against the Turks in the war, because
You mean actually physically running?
Physically running to escape from the village because the tanks were running after us, the Turkish tanks from Turkey.
Yes.
And as I was running, my mother says, let's leave to go to the next village. One of my best friend with her mother and her grandmother were behind me. So I turned to check if they were around, and if they were running as well. And then suddenly I see, the mother completely down on the ground, and then the older woman there. And then my best friend, but I didn't know what really happened, So then I froze, and my mother had to come back as she was running ahead of me with the other two kids. came back, picked me up, put me on her shoulder, and then, she saved me basically out of, getting killed.
Out of the tanks.
Yeah,
right,
so
right.
ever since that time, I mean, it's a longer story, but ever since that time, my big question has been, why do people out of the blue, I mean, it's not really out of the blue, but that's as a younger kid, that was my question. Why do they take guns and go and kill each other?
Yeah.
So that was my, kind of a personal question, but also it was like a community question. And for the longest time, I was trying to understand this question. Like everywhere I was going.
So have I. Yes. Why? Okay. Good. Do you have? And you've had many research articles and books out about this. Can you say why, or why do we kill each other?
Well, I mean, there are many different ways of understanding this, but one of my, own research is really talking to people, and interviewing many people, both like in Cyprus, but also elsewhere, like in the Middle East, of course,
Yes.
and in Africa. I think many times it's, usually it's explained as a national question.
Yes.
Somebody's our enemy, like we're Greeks, they are Turks. They are our enemies. They have been our enemies. But in reality, as you are starting to do more research, you realize there are more complex reasons. There are many economic reasons.
Right.
There are many. Sometimes.
Climate change as well.
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
yes.
That's very important. But also, I think we need to think about how different movements also mobilize, feelings of hatred, feelings of resentment, histories that were really problematic.
Yes.
And they use those as their way of mobilizing
Right.
people against each other. So on that level, I think, the international aspect is actually important, especially for small countries like, Cyprus, Lebanon, Syria. I mean,
Yes.
Syria is not that small, but those spaces, a lot of external powers have investments and vested interest in those spaces.
Right, right.
I
give you a couple of statistics. There are currently, the UN estimates, 244 million migrants, I should say, which is 3.3% of the population, which is an amazing number.
Exactly.
And people say, "Oh, they're just moving because they want to move." People don't leave their homes just to leave their homes. And the UN also estimates that 148 million people. 148 million people left their homes because of natural disasters or climate change. I think that's a number that's going to spike soon. So we're not talking something that's marginal, refugees that are marginal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I have done a little bit of research around the question of Haiti and post-disaster, and then also the Katrina,
Right.
In New Orleans. And of course, as probably many people know, that was a result of a catastrophe, which was more considered hurricane,
Right.
A larger climate question. But also there, what I discovered around the question of violence becomes really important, because that, especially with the Black population in New Orleans, what we discovered, a lot of the people that were on the lower zones in terms of, the community were the ones that were impacted the most. But those people were mostly Black population.
I see.
Yeah. So here, the climate change is linked also to questions of inequity and
Exactly.
questions of difference.
Right.
And this is where race plays a huge role,
Yes, this is where I think you although you have very different fields, they converge. And Kyle, I think that you talked about regional differences. So, like in the South, interracial couples are seen a little differently than they are in New England, for example. Could you talk a little about that?
Yeah, there's strategies that interracial couples will employ to feel sort of more safe in terms of the spaces they find themselves in. One of their strategies that couples talked about was restricting itinerary. That is, they feel a little bit safer in the back of a McDonald's than in a rest area in the middle of nowhere. And so there's a question of just security and safety, and that gets into questions about whether or not someone feels they're truly fully a citizen of the country,
Exactly,
where they feel they can really
if you have
freely
to
move
be,
and going to be viewed with suspicion, or like you don't belong, or a couple comes into a restaurant and something as benign as table for one, because they're immediately fragmented. They're not seen as being together in the eyes of the host or the other people waiting for a seat at the restaurant. So there's a question of that. I think that sometimes in the South, you know exactly where you stand. People are very direct and explicit about their racism. It's sort of old school racism.
Right.
That doesn't necessarily mean that we're more enlightened or without blemish here in the Northeast Corridor. It just means that we're a little bit more proper and express it in a different way.
Right. Now, interracial couples are increasing, right?
Oh, yes.
Do you have statistics on that? What's the rate?
Currently, people who are dating or in a committed relationship is as high as one in 5.
Right, 20%.
Yeah. So it's quite, and that may be including some intercultural situations as opposed to just purely interracial, but people from distinctly different backgrounds.
I see.
They may not immediately look like they're different, but they might, depending
on. You mean
their...
it could be Mexican and European type? That would be
another combination.
Part of it.
Sure.
There was one statistic in your book, Interracial Couples. There was one statistic that really upset me, which was in Alabama was the last state to repeal interracial marriages on the books, right?
The anti-miscegenation laws, the laws that prevented people from different racial backgrounds from getting together and marrying, yes.
And they took a vote on it, right?
Yeah.
And the alarming statistic, tell me, what was the alarming statistic?
I think that, it passed. They removed it from the books. With a whopping, 58% voting to remove it, but that meant 41% was thinking, why change anything?
Yes,
let's keep it on there.
41% were against that law. I mean, that's a very alarming statistic that there were so many people against it.
It could be, or it could be also that some folks are just afraid of any kind of change.
Yeah.
A change is not necessarily a good thing, and it's viewed with suspicion, And so they figure, we've done okay with it on the books up to this point, why change it now? And the answer is, it's been a long time since the original Supreme Court decision in 1967.
Yes.
Loving versus Virginia. So, I mean, that's a long time. So,
yes.
So how much is enough time, I guess, is the question.
Richard Rothstein argues that the government played a leading role in racial segregation and keeping blacks poor. What will it take to overcome this, do you think?
Yeah, well, I've been reading recently that in some communities and in some school systems, it's almost like there's a trend towards re-segregation.
Yes.
It's people are still, busing continues to this day. If you look even in the outlying areas of Boston, you have folks being bussed in from other parts of the city to try to make the school more diverse and more representative.
Right.
And so, I don't know. What will it take? It's going to require certainly not stepping backwards and cutting funds for such activities.
Yeah.
I mean, we're going to have to keep doing that. Otherwise, there's a problem where everyday citizens do not grow up and encounter diversity. They're not exposed to it. Therefore, it feels strange and unfamiliar, and it's something that's viewed with fear.
Mm. Now, Anna, you also talk about the people who are disadvantaged. I want to tell you, first of all, I'm a refugee as well. Okay, so just to be clear, you also talk about disadvantaged people, and you want to. If I understood your work, you want to see what the reasons for violence are, and so on. How does your work tie in with Kyle's?
On a few, first of all, I think violence cuts through many different fields. I don't think violence is just contained in one, let's say, place of study, let's say history or anthropology. I think violence is a social phenomenon that we are all faced with. So different people enter into that conversation from different angles. So my own perspective, my own area of study, since I'm a political scientist, I always start to think about it from larger systems. How does the state generate conditions for such violence,
right.
For instance, or how does the market generate conditions, if it does. Some people may say, no, it doesn't. The state is there to protect people, the market is there to help people get jobs. But if we study really carefully, these institutions, then we start seeing, that there is policies, there are strategies, there are practices, there are laws. Law plays a huge role in, deciding who is in, who is out,
yes.
in terms of access to resources, access to different, services that the system provides. So in that sense, I don't think that psychology, in a way, is very different from understanding, wanting to understand violence. What is different are the tools that are used by psychologists, or the knowledge systems that they use to help us understand and grasp violence. So in that sense, our commonality is that phenomenon, which is, violence. So the other...
and I'm kind of biased in my practice because I'm sort of a couple and family systems therapist.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, the different layers of the onion too. I'm thinking broader and broader out. What's person's location on these different variables, so social status variables and demographics, but then what's their location in terms of their religious affiliation or their community, or the nation state. It's never just the individual. It's a couple, a family, and a larger sort of system that they're a part of, they're ensconced in. And so sometimes I just broaden that out into broader, to bigger and bigger systems, to the point where it's like, okay, let's go to the International Studies Association and present something together, because it seems more complete and more inclusive. And
you've done that? You've presented things together?
Sure, right.
Many times.
Oh, that's really great. You have this wonderful relationship. As I said, you've been together since
a couple of years.
Just a couple of years since college and undergraduate.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
It's true. It's
and you both
true.
went out to do PhDs in different things.
Right.
Tell us now, Anna. Tell us, what role does the military play? Is it something that you study? Is it part of is it just that we give money to the military, make them strong? Is it some societies are more militaristic than others? Tell us.
I wasn't expecting a question on the military, but I will answer that question. Okay, so since violence is always in some way or another linked to, I think, if not the military directly as an institution, where they send soldiers to fight a war, the militarization of society.
Yeah.
And what do I mean with that? I mean, for instance, watching a lot of films that are really always talking about certain forms of militant violence.
Yes.
Or what, in another way, very simple. For instance, we see a protest, about a certain issue, and then we see a bunch of military people, the National Guard, basically, being there to protect, basically certain institutions from the protesters themselves. So in that sense, I think, military, or the role of military, is much bigger than just the institution. And I think this is where I think we need to think in a much broader sense than just, some militaries, let's say the U.S. military goes and fight a war in Iraq or a war in Afghanistan. But all that said, I still think militaries are, have become important at very particular. They were always important.
Yeah, they're always important.
But at particular moments, we see their role becoming so important in the sense that even though there is a claim that the military is there to protect the majority of the citizens, it ends up protecting or plays the way it really wages itself or positions itself, it ends up supporting particular interests more than others. So, for instance, I was just discussing with one of my students, she's writing a dissertation on Iraq, and it was interesting because one of the things that came up was how, in a way, Saddam, he had his huge military, but then he wasn't really he used it, of course, to kill people within, but at the same time, there were other things that mediated that military effect on the whole population. But post-sanction, during the sanction period in Iraq, talking about refugees again and displacement, because I want to connect it to the war and the military, we have seen the majority of the Iraqi people getting out of the country, and the populations that were left behind were the elites, basically the upper class that was linked to the military.
I see.
And the poorest, people of Iraq.
Who couldn't have any choice, yes.
So in that sense, the military, it's always to some extent plays a role in protecting particular dominant power interests within certain places.
Yeah.
And, it's much complicated than that. I'm simplifying it, but I think it's always linked to nationalisms, and nationalisms themselves are not always even within domestic borders in terms of how they treat different populations. Because if you have majority versus a minority, that plays a huge role. You come from
it's like I'm sorry, it's like Kyle's work, majority versus minority in there, and in your work you have two kinds of phenomena. One is how is an interracial couple seen from by other people, and how is it played out inside the race.
Right. W.B. Du Bois was talking about this idea of double consciousness. A person of color, a minority person, will have a vision of themselves, and there's a question of whether it's in conflict or it's consonant with society's sort of invention or definition of them.
Yeah.
And I sort of borrowed from that and said can be dyadic double consciousness, in the sense that interracial couples have their own notions about who they are, what they represent,
right.
and they maybe try to escape sensationalization. I know in the 80s and 90s there were a lot of talk shows, and they would put an interracial couple on every time, and they were fighting a lot, and they were sort of displayed as an example of just how not to be as a couple, but that was just for ratings. So they want to avoid that kind of vision of what it means to be interracial. They want to say, well, we're just ordinary people. We go through the same milestones as other couples go through, and we want to meet and date and marry and maybe have some kids, and we're just like everybody else. But sometimes that belies the fact that there's other complexities involved, because sometimes the families of origin don't always get right on board right away with these two people getting together from such different backgrounds. And if the families do sign on, they're still going to get some negative public reactions and situations where they feel like they're somehow less than.
Yes. How much is that in the family? You get negative feedback from the family on that? How much of that is societal? How much is family?
It's both. I don't want to, name names, but sometimes families are hoping that, that the grandchildren are going to be able to pass. And so lighter is better, and there's these sort of internalized Eurocentric standards that come forth. And so sometimes it's about things like that. Yeah.
It was like it just reminded me, one of Thomas Jefferson's sons by Sally Hemings looked very white. And so he just went off. When Thomas Jefferson died, he just went off to somewhere else and was never heard of again as a white person.
Yeah, he passed. He passed as a white person. And when you think about discrimination and prejudice in society, you can see why some folks would want to do that.
Yeah.
And skip all that and just have a life,
So, Anna, are we supposed to be optimistic or pessimistic from your work?
I don't know if I want to set it as being pessimistic or optimistic, but I really feel like it's important for people to recognize that in their everyday they are already working towards like a vision that betters the society, betters their own life, and they work also with other people in their own communities to do that. And I think sometimes people forget that they already know that they want some better societies that are not violent, societies that the military doesn't decide one day to get up and basically imprison them, or military goes elsewhere and invade other places, but they forget that they are already engaging in a struggle that is going to allow them to better the society. So sometimes people are thinking that somebody else is going to give them that vision. So from my work, I think that's if there is one message, is to give people that the way they sing poetry, the way they read poetry, the way they write poetry in their everyday life, the way they dance with each other. I think. And the way they really articulate and make claims about the society, it's important to remember that that's a vision, and that vision counts equally, like your president's vision or your prime minister's vision, or however you want to think about it. So for me, it's about reminding people about the struggles they find themselves in and the vision they have about their society.
Okay, I think we just have to wrap up. You want a 10-second little thing here before we wrap up, Kyle?
Well, she's in the hurting professions and I'm in the helping professions.
That's a nice way to put it. Anna Agathangelou, very nice that you're here.
Thank you.
Kyle, Killian, and this is New England Authors with Kameel Nasr. It's so good to talk with you and
Thank you so
share
much.
philosophical ideas. Thank you.
Thank you.